Just what is a snackable bake? On today's episode, we're going to get to the bottom of it. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and today I'm here with Molly Stevens. Hey, Molly.
Hello, Kate.
Before we get started in today's interview, I have to ask you a burning question. I can't believe I've never asked you this before, but have you ever used a microwave when baking? Or wait, I'm going to back up. Do you bake? Can't believe I don't know this.
Well, okay. First of all, when you say microwave and baking, my mind immediately goes to those mug cakes that were this big trend a few years ago, and you put a bunch of stuff in a mug, and it was like an office. You know, you'd make it at the office or something. Anyways, I never really understood what they were, and I never made one. So, but more to your question, Kate, one of my early, first professional jobs was I was the sole baker at a very busy vegetarian kind of hippie cafe in Vermont. And I remember I made heaps of, morning glory muffins and dense, whole wheat loaves and, of course, carrot cakes. But mostly these days, I don't bake a lot. When I do, I tend for savory things like crackers, and I like a good cheese biscuit. And for desserts, I lean towards, homey, rustic fruit galettes or crisps. But how about you, Kate?
I mean, I guess baking was my first love in the kitchen. It was one of those where I always found I wanted to make the crust for the apple pie, or I wanted cookies. So I'm going to learn how to make cookies so I can make sure our house has cookies around to eat. So my first real professional sort of job in a kitchen of any sort was as an afternoon cookie baker. It's funny because at that point then I started looking at the savory side and seeing the line cooks and thinking, ooh, that looks fun. I want to learn how to do that. But at the time I was happy as a clam making biscotti and cookies and cheesecake and all that fun stuff. But what's interesting, I think, for our topic of a conversation is sometimes when you learn how to cook in a professional situation, you sometimes don't realize how simple things can be. Years later, I was working in the Williams-Sonoma test kitchen. It was my first day, and I saw that I was going to have something that needed room temperature butter in a future test. So the very beginning of the day, I take out like a pound of butter. We're going to put it on the counter so it comes to room temperature. And the test kitchen cook I was with said, well, you can just microwave it for 10 seconds and then, flip it over. Microwave it another 10 seconds. You got room temperature butter. You don't have to take it out and let it come to room temperature. And in the bakery, we would just butter was always at room temperature. You just have heaps of it on the counter, or the eggs were always at room temperature because they were on the counter. So rethinking that, you don't have to make things complicated. There's simple ways that are maybe even more effective. And that's something that I think I didn't really realize until later, until I was writing recipes for home cooks.
Right. When you learn to bake in a professional setting. For me, the main thing, it's along the same lines about baking at home and developing recipes for home bakers is it's taught me to streamline, especially measuring tools and equipment. When I see a quarter teaspoon of cinnamon and then an eighth of a teaspoon of, something else, it's so then I have dirtied 2 measuring spoons. And maybe that's what you need. And in some cases you do, but maybe you don't. Maybe they could both be a quarter teaspoon, or, just doing things like that. So you haven't dirtied every single measuring utensil, every single pot and pan and bowl and whisk. Right.
And I think that's something that our guest today has done to an incredible level. So let's introduce her. So today we're going to be talking with Jessie Sheehan. She is the author of Snackable Bakes. She's also the author of a couple of other books that we're going to be talking about. But Snackable Bakes kind of came to me at the right time in my life. I was just tired. I had too much to do. I wanted sweets, but I just couldn't bear to do any complicated recipe that required the dough to chill. It's always chill the dough for 2 hours or overnight. And I've written this, so I know. And then I saw this book and I could immediately make this recipe from it. And I had a snackable bake. So we were going to learn exactly what her definition of a snackable bake is. One thing about Jessie is that she is the, quote, self-proclaimed queen of easy peasy sweets, simple, mind-bogglingly delicious and unfussy desserts and baked goods. So without any further ado, let's introduce Jessie. Jessie Sheehan, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much for having me. I know every single guest that you have says this, but I love your podcast so much, like legit freaking in love with it. Every guest, every conversation I'm fascinated by. And I joke that I wish it was like a call-in radio show, like of oldie days, and that I could call in and be like, hey, I have something to add. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here. Thank you for saying that. And we're big fans of Snackable Bakes. So we're going to talk about that today.
I know I almost introduced this podcast as Welcome to Everything Bakes, but it's everything cookbooks, everything podcasts, whatever. But Jessie, before we hit record, you had a cake that you were putting in the oven. What are you baking?
Believe it or not, I'm doing a peppermint bark off with William Sonoma. So I had to create a recipe with their famous peppermint bark. And so I am making a loaf cake that's filled with peppermint bark. And then I realized you can melt peppermint bark and turn it into a glaze. So I'm making a peppermint bark ganache. So I'm up to my ears in chocolate and peppermint.
Oh, not a bad thing to have up to your ears. I bet it smells really nice in your kitchen.
It does. It does.
So today we want to talk about all things Snackable Bakes, but we also just want to hear a little bit about your superhero origin story. So we've read that you were once a lawyer. Now, I want to know what kind of law you were practicing and what it was like being a lawyer. Were you the lawyer who brought like bakes to the office? Like what was your lawyer life like?
Okay, before I can tell you about lawyer life, just because you asked about bringing bakes to the office, the crazy thing about me is that I had never baked anything or been remotely interested in baking anything until about my younger child is 17 and he was 1. So until about 16 years ago. So even though I've always had a voracious sweet tooth since I was a little girl and grew up around double stuffed Oreos and Pepperidge Farm raspberry turnovers and other store-bought treats like Devil Dogs and Suzy Q's, nobody was ever baking from scratch in my home, and it never even occurred to me to be interested in baking from scratch. So I always joke that no, my first word was not whisk. I was not at my grandmother's apron strings like, show me what to do. Instead, I was happily at the table munching away on something that came out of a package.
So an eater before a baker.
100%. I always say I have a voracious sweet tooth. I always have, but it took me kind of a while to realize, like I could learn to make this stuff and then I would have it all the time because I would be making it for myself. But long story short, I went to law school. And before that, believe it or not, I was an actress. So I joke that I'm really on my 4th career because I was an actress, a lawyer, a stay-at-home mom, and now a baker. But I was an actress and I had left acting because I wanted something with a little bit more of a meritocracy. I wanted to have that kind of job where if you work hard and you're good at your job, you actually succeed. And I felt like in acting, that was a little hard. There's so much luck involved and chance. So anyway, I went to law school a few years after I graduated from college. I loved school because I'm a nerd and I love writing and I love getting good grades. Don't tell. It's a little embarrassing, but I do. So I loved my classes. I loved everything about being in school. I absolutely despised practicing. I clerked for a judge for a year when I graduated, and that again is a lot of writing and a lot of kind of nerdy stuff that I enjoyed. But the practicing, oh my God, I was a litigator. I went into entertainment law because I thought that would be sexy. There was nothing sexy about it. I wanted to settle every case I got. The partners hated me because every single case I said, I think we're at fault and I think we should settle. And every single case they said, you're absolutely wrong. Go make a lot of money and file a ton of motions. So it was just not a good fit. I cannot tell you guys, I think literally everything about it. Also, I'm like a morning person. I wanted to get to the office at 8 and then leave at 7 and still put in a super long day. But that's not the culture of a law firm. I mean, maybe it's a little different now because I bet a lot of people are working from home, which is fantastic. But back then, it's like you needed to be sending an email from the office at 2 in the morning to kind of show what you were made of. So just everything about it didn't quite work. And when my older son, who's now 19, when he was born, I went on maternity leave. So I joke that I am still on maternity leave because I never went back. And then after I had another little boy and I had these 2 little cuties at home was when I finally got this bug about maybe trying to learn to bake. So there was a neighborhood bakery that I loved called Baked, for those that live in New York. They may have heard of it. And I went into Baked and I basically said, hi, I'd like to learn to do what you guys do. You don't have to pay me. I just want to be your intern or your apprentice. And they thought I was insane. I mean, I was like a mom. It was so bizarre, I think, what I was asking and like who I was. And I was really enthusiastic. I left a note for the head baker with like 20 exclamation points, like trying to indicate my enthusiasm. And I think, it was like hip, cool Brooklyn. Like no one uses exclamation points. Like, what are you, crazy? You're not getting a job here. So I went back like a week later and I was like a little more chill, a little less mom, a little less excited. And they took a chance on me. And I got super, super lucky because soon after I started working there, and, don't get me wrong, they started me like vacuum sealing bags of granola, which I wasn't even.
But you were getting paid? You weren't an intern?
No, I was totally an intern.
Okay. Yeah.
Wait, I've got to ask, had you ever baked anything before you were vacuum sealing bags?
Literally, maybe we're all the same age-ish. I don't know. But what I had baked was, do you remember or did you ever see stir and frost cakes? They were literally cakes like a Betty Crocker, Duncan Hines situation, but it literally came with the pan.
It was a cardboard aluminum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That is what I had baked. And don't get me wrong, I still love us. I don't even know if they exist, but I joke that every cake I make, I'm trying to make it taste like a cake from a box because I really love that texture and that flavor. I love everything about a chocolate cake or a vanilla cake from a box. But anyway, that was about it. I mean, legit, I had no idea what I was doing. Hence the granola vacuum sealing. Like, it's not like they could throw me in the kitchen and be like, make a loaf cake. I'd be like, what's a cake with a loaf? What do you mean?
Right.
Loaf food?
Right. How do you get
fold
loaves
it in?
Yeah,
How do you fold anything in?
Right.
Like, these aren't clothes.
I mean, fold it. Is there a letter somewhere that you need folding? Like, I was really out of it. But I was a hard worker. And even though everyone was, straight out of cooking school, except, and I was like at least a decade older than everyone there. I don't know. Somehow I fit in. I had a great relationship with the people that I was working with, and they slowly but surely gave me different tasks to do, like making the loaf cakes or making the cookie dough. Nobody was asking me to do anything complicated for a while, but after about 7 or 8 months, they started paying me. And also, I got very lucky because the two guys that owned the bakery were writing their first cookbook. And they needed somebody to test and not develop yet, although I did end up developing recipes for them. They needed someone to test recipes. So I just got insanely lucky, like crazy, kismet. I had no idea I would even be interested in cookbook writing, which now, sorry to bury the lead, but that's what I love.
Right.
That's everything.
Well, it's so interesting, Jessie, listening to your background and how you went to law school because you liked being in school, which is a road I almost took. And then my father, who was a lawyer, steered me away from it. He goes, no, don't do that. But it was just the idea of being able to go back to school. But I'm thinking you describe yourself as a nerd. And so someone who likes school, likes the nerdy approach to things, recipe testing is kind of a great way to apply all that skill.
Oh my gosh, Molly, it was literal heaven.
Yeah.
Because it was, it was being very precise. I mean, I still say, like, I cook dinner because I have to feed my family, but if I didn't have to feed them, I would never cook savory food. It's not my jam. I'm not one of those people who loves kind of like riffing and what do I want to put in this? I love to follow rules and recipes. And so looking at a recipe that needed to be tweaked because I was testing it for someone, that was heaven for me, Molly. Like, loved it. And I realized very soon in helping them with their books how much I enjoyed, I guess I enjoy the science of baking. I do, but it's just all that precision, all that rigidity, all the rules. I mean, I sound like literally the most uninteresting person in the room, but that's me. I love all of that. So to me, being asked to test recipes and then eventually as they continue to write books to develop them, that was like this gift that I didn't even know was a possibility.
Right.
And it's so funny that that's how I got into like this. My first book, Icebox Cakes. I mean, I wrote that book, way earlier than most people are writing their first cookbook because I had gotten so lucky with getting kind of into bed with these guys that were writing their books at my bakery and then meeting their agent and getting hooked in with their literary agency. So it was like just this unbelievably sweet and perfect storm. of events that kind of fell into
Wow.
place for me super early on. And as I know your listeners know, not how people are usually writing cookbooks. Usually it's much more of a slog situation, and they have an idea that they've always wanted to write about, and they're looking for an agent and this and that. And with Icebox Cakes, which is my first book that came out in 2015, this literary agency that I was now in touch with through the guys from Baked, basically an agent there said, hey, we know this woman, she wants to write a book about icebox cakes, but she needs a co-writer and a recipe developer. Do you want to do it? I mean, literally, that's how it happened. I don't even want to say that out loud because it was so crazy lucky.
Well, I would argue that you make your own luck. I mean, you were working for 7 months at that bakery doing unsexy jobs, and you weren't complaining about it. I mean, I think that actually you were putting in some time.
Unpaid for some of it, too.
It was like your culinary school.
It totally was. And what's interesting about that I always say to people now, because I'm sure like all of us, I get emails or DMs like, this is what I get. I'm thinking of making a career change. Can you, and I know you've done that, can you talk to me about that? And one thing I do say to people, although I think my path is a good one, first of all, not everyone is fortunate enough to be able to take some time and work for nothing. And I totally get that. Right. The other thing is, what I fear is that it's more competitive now. I just feel like a lot of people might be doing what I was doing 16 years ago. Whereas when I did it, they were thrilled to have me.
Right.
I don't know for sure, obviously, because I'm not running a bakery or any kind of, brick and mortar shop right now. And I don't know what you guys think about that, but I do think I was fortunate in terms of my timing as well. I think now, I don't know, food is even sexier than it was 15 years ago, and people wanting to be cookbook writers and bakers and this, I don't know. You guys know better than me, but it seems like it's even harder right now to break in. Do you think I'm right? Or
that's a really good point.
It's more part of the mainstream culture than it was. There was a food culture but you mentioned the literary agency, and that is something we were wondering about. So you became connected with the literary agency because that's who the Baked people were using.
100%.
And we're just wondering, with your background, your legal background, did you still feel you wanted to be represented by an agent? Did you ever consider going it alone?
First of all, as I told you, I didn't actually love being a lawyer. So the idea that I'd then be looking at my own contracts, like I'd have PTSD, like I wouldn't be able to handle it. Also, I'm one of those people, like I just like to stay in my lane. I wanted to be the baker and the cookbook writer, and was more than happy to have someone helping me with that. I also think, because I have friends they're designers, they're not cookbook writers, but they had this deal with Rizzoli, and they decided to do it themselves without an agent. And I think people get very excited about the idea of saving the 15% or whatever it is. But in general, I don't think people, well, maybe some of us are, but I don't think a lot of people are aware of just how much a good agent does for you in terms of the contract. Things that I'm not even though I've now written 3 books and I'm just signed a contract for my 4th book. Even that, people don't realize. I'm still surprised by what my agent is asking for in the contracts that we're working on. I don't even understand it. And I'm now 3.5, let's say, books contracts in. So I would say it would never have occurred to me to like, I think I'll do a deep dive on this and do it myself.
Right.
Well, so you, for the Icebox Cakes, you were the co-author. What was your role like in that? So that seems like a very good first gig, right? To be a co-author and not have to just do the whole thing yourself.
It was great. And interestingly enough, my co-author, I think she still is, but then she was a literary agent herself. So she was just one of those multi-talented people who kind of had her hands in many different pots. So she knew everything. I mean, it was such a different time, guys. Like Icebox Cakes, we wrote a 3-page proposal. If it came out in 2015, we were probably doing this in 2012, let's say, because we had an extra long time for this book. But, we wrote a 3-page proposal with maybe one recipe. That's it. And we had Abrams, we had Chronicle. I don't know if there was a third, but we had the top tier publishers were like, oh yeah, we want to do this book. Wow. So just note to listener, like, I'm sure that does happen to some people. That has never happened to me.
You're right. It was a different time. I think there was all of a sudden, I think around maybe 2005, between 2005 and 2015, it was just this boom time. Publishers were all like, the cookbook genre had really shifted into these beautiful books that had so much in. And I think all of a sudden, that's when I think maybe it was the tipping point where the broader public started paying more attention. So by 2015, I think by 2015, 2016, all of a sudden you're seeing it's just so much more competitive in a way. I mean, it's always been hard,
100%.
so I'm not sure. I can't say that it's harder now than ever before, but it just seems different now for sure. Then the people who are getting books real quickly are different than the ones who might have gotten books 10 years ago, just based on an idea that, oh, there's a market for that idea. Let's run with it.
100%. The idea that you wouldn't have to do a real proposal, even though you were a total unknown. The idea that two of the top publishers in the country are just like, oh yeah, I want it. Also, the interesting thing about the climate then, there was really no social media. I mean, I joined Instagram when when the book came out in 2015, but you weren't competing with huge social media stars to get cookbook deals. It just didn't exist. It was either you were this was your thing and you wanted to take it a step further and write a book. It wasn't like, no judgment for anyone and everyone that's getting their cookbook deals, but it was just maybe less saturated than the market of people that wanted the deals. The other thing I was going to say, working with a co-author was an excellent experience for a first cookbook, as you said, but also it's hard. I mean, I think you guys know, I mean, working with other people can be tough. It can be great, but it can be tough. I was basically the recipe developer, but then I realized I actually wanted to have more of a say in some of the writing. And so I remember our editor writing to us, Chronicle published the book and saying, okay, this is great, but the entire introduction is written by, Jessie isn't part of the introduction. Do you want to switch that up? And I was like, I just didn't know, I was like, oh, I'll just do the recipes. That'll be enough. So again, I feel like that was a little unique for the time that I was writing it. But I guess word to the wise when you're co-authoring, important to sort of set up what actually means to you maybe before you begin the writing.
But I do think it's hard when it's your first, it's like this huge break. So you've gone from vacuum sealing granola to getting to co-author a cookbook, and you just feel so fortunate that you're like, yes, of course. And so, these are things we can learn sort of in hindsight. But so then 3 years later, you wrote your second book, and this is a solo book, The Vintage Baker.
Yep, exactly.
Tell us a little bit about that book and that process. If I understand it right, the inspiration comes from your collection and your love of vintage recipes.
Yeah, so that was a funny one. I worked with the same editor and with Chronicle again. So the same person who had edited Icebox Cakes, as sometimes, one gets lucky and one publisher says, okay, what's your next idea? And that's like, I remember my editor saying, like, she was in California, obviously that's where Chronicle is. And she was like, I'm coming to town. Let's meet up. I'd love to talk about your next idea. And I was like, next idea?
Right.
Like, again, I was so...
But asking you, just you.
Yes.
She's noticed you, just like when you were working as the granola sealer, they noticed you to become a recipe tester. So it is that putting yourself and doing, so what did you do at that meeting, Jessie?
Well, I mean, I'm embarrassed. I'm just going to come out and I'm going to come clean. This is my moment of truth. I literally looked over at my bookcase and saw my recipe booklets, and I was like, oh, I'm going to write a book about those recipe booklets. Fantastic. So when I went to, it's insane.
That's fantastic.
So when I went to meet Amy and she said, what are you working on? I'm like, well, I'm in love with my recipe booklets. And just so your listeners know, basically the Vintage Baker is me kind of twisting and tweaking recipes from the 1890s to the 1950s that were part of little tiny recipe pamphlets, which were an advertising tool for big companies. So like, I was going to say King Arthur, but it wasn't King Arthur. Like Swan's Down Cake Flour would have a pamphlet that you would buy in the 1930s, or that was given to you for free when you bought a box of the flour. And the recipe booklet or pamphlet was filled with recipes calling for Swansdown cake flour. Same thing with, with baking powder and baking soda.
Appliances had them too.
I was just going to say I have a Frigidaire.
Yeah. Oh, I do too. I have a recipe from that in my latest book that I tweaked from a Frigidaire. Yeah, it's awesome.
Oh, I love.
So, but you're collecting these vintage booklets, but before you were a baker?
Another great question. I think that the timing is that I was working at Baked, and I think I was maybe with my little kids in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, kind of near the bakery. Maybe I'd pick them up after school or whatever it was, and we passed a kind of like a junk shop, a vintage shop, and I saw this basket on the ground of the shop filled with all these whimsically illustrated and these whimsical covers of all of these little booklets. And so I had started working at Baked, but I wasn't necessarily buying all the booklets because I was dying to get home and bake from them. I just thought they were incredibly cool and awesome and wanted to look at them. So I was sort of almost drawn to them aesthetically before I was sort of drawn to the idea of doing something professionally with them or writing about them. And when I pitched the idea to my editor that I could write this book that would be to 70 recipes, each one would come from a specific pamphlet of mine. We would have a photograph of the pamphlet, and then we would also have the recipe that I had tweaked for the 21st century baker, as it were. Many old recipes, there's no vanilla, there's no salt, there isn't a ton of flavor. They're a beautiful, I think, blank canvas for having a ton of fun as a recipe developer, because I like to think the structure, like the foundation of the recipes, is pretty good. They were tested in these kitchens for all of these appliance companies and product companies. But then I could have so much fun playing with them to make them more of a 21st century baker's jam, as it were.
Well, it sounds like it's a perfect combination of you have that sort of, I'm going to be good at school, I'm going to put my nerd brain on, I'm going to do the research, and I have all these booklets. You've got the lawyer brain who's going to look at it analytically, and now you've worked at this great bakery, and now you have all these new ideas of better ingredients or different ingredients that can bring those recipes to life. So
totally.
I can see why Chronicle said this is a great idea. And they could probably even visualize how beautiful a book like that could be.
Yes, they make such beautiful books.
They do. And I want to ask, though, looking at the Vintage Baker versus Snackable Bakes, I mean, it seems like a complete departure in a way. It's a departure in voice. It's a departure in aesthetics. Even the structure of how you word how to make the recipe is completely different.
Yes.
So how did you jump from the Vintage Baker with Chronicle Books now to Snackable Bakes, which was 6 years after the Vintage Baker came out?
4 years.
4 years. 4 years.
It was 2018, and Snackable Bakes was 2022.
And really, it's the first time the recipes are solely yours, too. Solely original.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
Jessie Sheehan recipes.
Totally. So two things I want to say. First, I want to say the other funny thing about writing The Vintage Baker was that actually my legal skills did have to play a part, because I had to Chronicle did not call all of these companies on my behalf to find out if we could use the covers of the booklets. And we all believed that using the booklets, the art was really important. So I spent as much time writing the recipes for that book as I did tracking down and following up with the CEO of like Nestle. I mean, maybe not the CEO, but, tracking down all of these companies, Hecker's Flour, the marshmallow fluff guys, all of them, the campfire permission. Marshmallow peeps.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes, the Snackable Bakes was so much fun to write in a completely different way than Icebox Cakes or the Vintage Baker, because it is just 100% me. I think when I wrote the Vintage Baker, I probably didn't have, I don't want to admit this really, but I probably didn't have a voice yet. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
It was also the way Chronicle was. They were hiring Jessie Sheehan to write these ideas that they liked, even if I brought the ideas to them. With Snackable Bakes, it was a much different experience because it was actually Countryman being interested in what Jessie Sheehan wanted to do. Obviously I had to write a proposal and they had to be interested in my easy peasy baking idea. But it was the first time that like my voice and who I am and my style and vibe and all of it was part of the package. So I think when I wrote The Vintage Baker, it sounds so silly, but it didn't even occur to me to bring personality into writing that book, because all I was focused on was like, this is my idea. I want to do a really good job. I've developed these recipes. Here they are. And I don't know, maybe it was a slightly different time. That may not even be fair. It may just have been, it was a different time for me. But there was definitely, I feel like I had less of a, this sounds so whatever, to reduce it to this, but I was less of a brand then. You know, I think because of social media and the pandemic, really, many of us kind of developed a voice to kind of grab and connect with people during a time when maybe there wasn't a lot of interfacing with people on the regular. So for me, for instance, during the pandemic, I got very into TikTok and then very into Reels and very into making all these videos that allowed me to connect with a really big audience. And through that, I suddenly had this kind of brand that I hadn't even intended to go out and create. But putting myself out there so frequently, people started to say like, peeps, like this funny thing that I say, I'm not even aware that I'm saying it. Suddenly people were picking up on that, and that became part of like who I am. Or, oh, Jessie, do you mean that girl who always says peeps? Like, and over that period of time, so that would have been sort of halfway between when The Vintage Baker was written and when Snackable Bakes was written, I feel like this brand of mine emerged. Again, not in any way in which I was planning on it. Like, oh, I think I'm going to say peeps a lot and see what people think. You know, it just sort of happened naturally. But because of that, when it became time to write this book, I had this voice.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? That had sort of emerged during a period of time where the only thing I can say is I was building a brand. I didn't even know I was doing it, but being on those platforms, which were different than when Instagram was just a photograph. I mean, yes, you could put a little personality in your caption, but really adding video to the mix, I think, at least for me, maybe it's the former actress in me, who knows, but that was an opportunity for me to be much more than like someone who makes cakes.
This video content you were creating were recipes, were
yes,
baking content.
They were all baking. It was all baking content, but it was like a lot of personality connected to the baking. I wasn't like the quiet baker, like, look, peeps, I just folded some flour in. I was like, peeps,
right. The quiet baker, that's a different brand. The quiet
baker,
yes.
That can be, the book you'll never write. But
it's so interesting, Jessie, how the through line of your story, I mean, you've said several times like, oh, I just fell into this and I didn't really know. But the through line of going from, loving the big flavor of double stuffed Oreos to, your nerdy approach to things. But it's the development of a voice is what I'm hearing. And
100%.
Your little thing about the introduction of the Icebox Cakes books, you're like, well, should I be involved in that introduction? Should my voice be present there? But you hadn't found your voice yet. And so somehow video allowed you to find this voice. So let's talk about the proposal process for and even, I don't know, the idea for Snackable Bakes, the title. Was that from the get-go?
Can you actually explain what a snackable bake is for our audience? I know it's in the introduction.
Of course. So essentially, I had always wanted to write. As soon as The Vintage Baker came out in May of 2018, I said, I want to write a one bowl baking book. I really want to write a one bowl baking book. That's my jam. Can we please write a one bowl baking book? And my agent and I tried, but nobody was, and we actually got very close at one point. This would have been probably summer of 2019. There was interest, but it didn't end up happening. So even though my agent and maybe everyone said, I don't think it's going to work. Nobody wants a one bowl baking book. I couldn't let go of that idea of baking in a really easy peasy, streamlined way. Snackable Bakes is essentially my one bowl baking book. We're just not calling it that. And yes, there might be two bowls sometimes, but essentially a snackable bake is an easy baking or not baked recipe that can be assembled in 20 minutes or less with ingredients that are already in your pantry, with equipment, really just a bowl, a whisk, and a spoon. Maybe if you're going to put buttercream frosting on something, I'm going to ask you to pull out your stand mixer, but I really hate making you do that. So I really try to never do that. All of the recipes in the book can fit on one page with then a photograph on the other page. That I feel like we all know it. People bake and eat with their eyes. And I still have recipes in the Vintage Baker, which I feel like people have never made because there's no photograph. And again, that's an expensive endeavor because there are 100 recipes and every single one has a photograph. But I think that helps bring all of the recipes to life as opposed to just the ones that have photographs. So the ingredient list is short. The instructions are easy to follow. They're also short. I'm one of those people. I mean, gosh, do I love an Ottolenghi recipe? Yes, yes, yes. If someone wants to make it for me, please, please, please. But my eyes they roll back a little bit. I get a little overwhelmed when the recipes go from page to page to page. I know you guys have talked about this. I can even, I think, hear Molly's voice in my head from earlier episodes. I too like to be I like to hold my readers' hands. I do like to put a lot of information into a recipe because I like to bake that way or cook that way. I love the way Deb Perlman writes. I feel like she's such a great hand holder and there's so much personality in her recipes. But I did try in this book to pull out a little bit of the handhold, maybe a little bit less than I would do so normally, only because I was trying to keep things streamlined. What I think is slightly funny, and again, I've just been listening to you guys talking about voice on the podcast and thinking about this, at least for me, when I started to, when I wrote my recipes, I had a whole different recipe writing style than the Vintage Baker, again, because I'm trying to keep things short and sweet and direct. And you guys have talked about this too, with a little bit of personality in the recipe itself. Like, don't worry, peeps, it's going to be a thin batter. Like, I do like a little bit of that in there. But what I thought was kind of funny is when I wrote the head notes for this book, they just fell out of my body. Like, I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to be funny and irreverent in my head notes. It was just sort of, I had gotten so used to this way of kind of talking about food and baking and talking to my people, as it were, that they just kind of flowed right out of me. And you guys were just talking about this, I think maybe 2 episodes ago, about head notes and how you guys write them and whether you wait till you've written all the recipes and then you do your head notes and taking notes, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanted to add my 2 cents there. I had to develop the recipes for this book fairly quickly because we were on a bit of a tight timeline. So what I would do, I would write the recipe. I would put notes into the doc that would become the head note so that I could remember to say, the batter's thin, or this reminds me of, when I ate ice cream with my dad when I was little, like little notes so that when it came time to write the head note, my memory would be jarred. But I did wait until the end of the recipe developing testing process to write them, only because the process of writing the book was sped up. But same with the introduction. Like, I wrote the introduction to the book and it just poured out of me. And I know that's not super helpful for listeners because it's hard to do. I'm not saying, oh, I'm so good at it. It's so easy. It poured out of me. I hate it when people say things like that. But I just mean they're not saying it'll be this easy for me again. But something about this subject matter, something about the time in my career when I was finally getting to have my own voice in a book, and something about all this video that I had created and becoming a, quote, I hate these words, but like content creator, whatever you call me, something about it made it really easy for me to write this book. I was so surprised when my editor read it and she's like, oh my gosh, this is so great. I was like, it is?
Right, because it's so different. It's really different. If you go back to look at the Vintage Baker, even just, I'm just going to read an instruction that's in your espresso ganache swirl no churn ice cream. It's, gently fold the whipped cream into the milk mixture in 2 installments and place the bowl in the freezer to chill for about 25 minutes. Fine. Then you say, this initial freezer time helps set the ice cream so when you swirl in the ganache, it stays swirly and we're all about the swirl. Am I right? So what's really impressive is that you have recipes, you have voice in the instructions, which I know is really hard to do. It's something that I struggle with figuring out if I am capable of pulling it off. But you do it and you're still sticking to that one page. So tell us a little bit about just how you worked with the design, because I feel like you're right. Yes. The design is really crucial with this idea of snackable bakes. You don't want a 3-page recipe.
No. And it's funny, now my memory is jarred. The woman who is the cookbook writing teacher that you guys just interviewed.
Tori Ritchie. Yeah.
Yes. She was the one where you guys talked a lot about head notes and about, what did you guys call that voice?
Happy robot voice.
Yes. So I thought a lot about happy robot voice after listening to that episode and about how you avoid writing every head note. This is so yummy. You're going to love it so much. And how you stay away from that. Anyway, that was a quick aside.
As an aside, I'm sorry, we want to talk about the design process, but it's just like what Tori was saying, and we make fun of Happy Robot Voice, and over again in food writing classes, we are taught to avoid superlatives, don't stack up the adjectives, don't say this is the best. Yet, Jessie, you do it. And you pull it off. You do it. You are so effusive. Your enthusiasm is contagious. You say utterly mouth-watering, mind-bogglingly scrumptious. I mean, all these things, and yet it works. The prose almost sparkles.
Oh,
But I use that word very deliberately because, if I'm not mistaken, it was a nickname that you had as a kid.
Yes.
And so
Sparkle Plenty.
I Sparkle Plenty, which is you use in a recipe title as well. And so I think it's got to have something to do with why it works, because it's not cloying, because that's who you are. I mean, that's how you communicate.
Well,
so
I mean, again, it sounds a little and thank you, Molly, but it sounds a little cliche, but I feel like, and I feel like this should be on a Hallmark card, but like, I'm very true to myself. Right? It's very honest. It's the way I write. It's the way I talk. It's actually the way I feel about things. I always joke. I mean, I do not have a very sophisticated palate. I'm just going to come out and say it. Like, I'm like, this is delicious. What's in it? Like, I'm not one of those people who's like, I taste the herbs and the this. And oh my gosh, what are you using? So I feel like the way I wrote this book, it's just me talking to you the way I would talk to you if you were at my house and I was serving you something that I had just made.
With 4 exclamation points after it.
Right.
Yeah,
But it's really hard sometimes to write the way you talk and pull it off.
Yeah.
So was it something that if you hadn't done those videos, do you think you would have been able to find your voice in the same way? Or was the video like a crucial part of like a linking in your brain? Because you already knew how to write. You could put sentences together in a beautiful way. But what was it about doing those videos that you think just changed it for you?
I think what was different about the videos, or what was different about having more of a presence on social media than I had previously, is that my whole shtick, my whole personality was like accepted by all these people. And it was just like, I was being myself, and that was the thing. So then when I started to write the book, I was just being myself writing the book. Like now when I look back on it, I'm not kidding, guys. And I'm sure you've had experiences like this sometimes, but it just flowed out of me. There was none of that, oh gosh, I do a lot of freelance work. You know, sometimes I'm writing these head notes for these magazines or newspapers. And I'm like, oh my God, my head's going to explode. I have no idea what to say. But when I just get to be myself 100% and just, it flows right out of me. I wanted to write this book so badly for so many years that it was easy to say, this is why I love this cake so much. I'm going to tell you right now. This is why I love this cookie so much. This is why I know it scares you, but you're going to have to use a little shortening in this recipe. I swear to you, you're going to get the texture you want. You're going to get the this you want. Please just do it. Like it was so easy for me to kind of have authority, you know, and to feel like I knew what I was talking about. I won't lie. The other 2 books, not sure I had that much authority yet.
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about this because I think it's really important. You know, I hope we don't talk too much about rules of food writing on this podcast, but you know, we do. We talk guidelines and things that have worked for us and stuff. But it's important to understand that it's not one size fits all. And even though we're all counseled to avoid overly whatever, if that's who you truly are, it really goes back to finding your true voice. So I think it's interesting to point out that sometimes guidelines are meant to be,
I totally agree. I'll also say that for me, if somebody had asked me when I was writing The Vintage Baker to like use your voice, like be yourself, like I wouldn't have known who that was.
Right.
I didn't know as a food, at least in the food world. I hope I knew, like in my marriage and with my children. But
that's another podcast.
But, yeah, that's exactly. That's everything relationships. But you know, I would not have known what to do, and I feel like very grateful, but also really lucky that my voice just came to me, because I know you're talking about this in the podcast, and I feel for the listeners because I can imagine that can be somewhat confusing, but. Who am I? Like, what is my voice? Like, how am I different? What am I bringing to the table that's different from someone else? And that was like a brand too. I mean, I hate to use that word, although I already did. It's, to me, brand and voice are not that different. Do you know what I mean? I don't even know how it happened. But again, over the pandemic, all this social media stuff, et cetera, I developed this brand and voice and personality and persona that is total. I mean, I'm chatting with you guys. You get it. It's not different than how I am right now, but it worked. And I was able to use it without having to be like, oh gosh, because you know what everybody says? What's your hook? A hook is in an idea, but it can also be in in who you are as the writer. And I feel like I got lucky in the sense that I feel like I have a strong brand at this point. People know what kinds of books or content to expect from me. And I'm so grateful for that because it's now I'm getting a little repetitive, so apologies, but it's very true to who I am. So I don't feel like, oh shit, I got to get out there and do this Jessie brand. It's like, I'm not doing anything. That's exactly how I talk to my kids.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there are many, many brands that are inauthentic, but to me, the ones that resonate are the ones that are true. But let's go. I didn't mean to hijack this conversation because Kate, you were asking about design, and I am very curious about the process of why the timeline was so short and how it was like to work with.
Yep. So essentially, when my agent and I were kind of shopping the book, one of the things we were offering, because we just thought the moment was right for an easy baking book, this was, post-pandemic-ish. I guess I sold it in, May of 2021. We thought that it made sense to say, hey, you got to do this book with Jessie. And FYI, if you do it, she's going to get it done for you in a year. So it was sort of part of our packaging. Baking was a thing during the pandemic. And I don't even know why we believed this, but it ended up being true. We believed that I could write it that quickly. As I want to say to your listeners, although I hope they know this, that is incredibly unusual for a book to be sold in May of one year and come out the May of the next year. It basically means that in the month of May, the way I write a cookbook, I don't know how you guys do it, but my first thing is I just write the table of contents. Even though I don't have recipes attached to it, I just come up with all the recipe ideas, as it were. That was already part of the proposal. So that was done. I spent the month of May going through all 100 recipes and writing them out. I like to draft all the recipes before I even go into the kitchen. And maybe I also wanted to do it that way because I was writing quickly. So I spent the month of May drafting 100 recipes. And then I spent June and July basically testing those 100 recipes. I worked with one of my very good friends from my baked days. She was my recipe tester, like my right-hand woman. Every recipe I did, went to her, but because she's a very experienced baker, much more talented than I am, with a much more interesting palate, I would say, is this too sweet? Because I make everything too sweet. Is this too extra? Because I'm calling for heavy cream. Should we just use milk? She was able to help in so many ways. It wasn't just a tester who says, oh, it worked. Oh, it didn't work. Stephanie was able to say, when I made it, I cut the sugar by a third and it's fine. Huh. So we were able to work together, and I trust her implicitly.
What was an average day like?
I'm pretty sure I had to do 10 recipes a day to make it work. Not a day, a week.
Okay. I was like,
I was just like, oh.
Yeah. It's still, when I
you
say
are
it
a
out
hummingbird,
loud,
you're not a human. Yeah, right.
Yeah, when I say it out loud, it still is crazy. Because
10 recipes a week is a lot.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. Maybe it was only 7 a week. But yeah, I had to work incredibly efficiently. And as I'm sure you guys know in recipe testing, sometimes you get it right on the first time and maybe you tweak it a little bit, but you're done. And sometimes you have to do it 20 times. And unfortunately, I'm the kind of person that if I have an idea, it's really hard for me to let it go, even when it doesn't work. So I would be the person who kept going back, kept going. I'm the person who reads a book, and even if I don't like it, I want to finish it. So that didn't serve me all that well on the recipes that didn't work, because I didn't want to give up on them.
Yeah.
And then Stephanie was also on a similar, she would get the recipe and turn it around very quickly, because if it had a lot of problems and either she or I needed to redo it, I needed to know about it. So what I am amazed and so grateful for is that the recipes work. They're being well received, because in general, as we all know, as recipe developers and cookbook writers, who wants to do that? It's like an awful way to work, because you're afraid that you haven't spent, then I'd read about some cookbook writer who's like, every recipe I test 10 different times in 10 different kitchens with 10 different, and I'd be like, oh my God, I did it twice, or I did it 5 times. So I'm one of those people that's always like, my husband calls it compare and despair, but I'm always comparing myself to other people. I'm like incapable of just being like, Jessie, you're great. Keep going. I'm always like, I suck. Oh my God, I'm a loser. So it was very hard.
Right. I think I saw, and probably was on Instagram, I saw someone post about with your, I think it was your chocolate creme fraiche banana bread. And it was like one of, like last, like 2022 has just not been a year I've wanted to do any kind of project baking. And I like to bake, but I just thought, I need that. I need that. Yeah. And then I need the book that goes with that. And I don't know, I've made that recipe now like 5 times because it lives up to your promise. And that's one thing that I know Molly and I want to ask you about is like, how do you have, like you set yourself up for a huge challenge. In the introduction, you promise that these recipes are easy, that you don't need a lot of stuff, that you can get it done in an hour. So what was that part like when you're creating these recipes?
Well, so hard, I won't lie. And I am so like, I was at the Union Square Green Market a couple of weeks ago signing books, and somebody came up to me and they said, I don't want to buy your book because I already have it. And I just want to say it's one of the only books I've read where you actually keep your promise. You know, she was so grateful that I said it would take 20 minutes or less, and it actually does. I so appreciated hearing that because that was incredibly important to me. I'm one of those people who, I'm not kidding, I'm literally don't even care what the recipe is for. I'm the one looking in my cookbooks for what's the shortest recipe, who has the shortest ingredient list. That's what is appealing to me. And I can't stand it when I pick one and then there's a hidden step that takes longer. Right. I think that I was able to do that because legit, Kate, it's like how I want to bake, how I want to cook. It is so much me that like I couldn't imagine it doing it any other way because it's the only way I want to make things. Sometimes when you put structure around or rules around what you're trying to do, it's tough to follow them. Like with the Vintage Baker, I mean, I admitted to you guys, I came up with the idea because I looked over at my bookshelf when my editor sent me an email. Don't tell anyone, every single listener. Listeners, please keep it a secret. But, you know, it's harder when it works that way because then you're kind of sticking a round peg into a square hole or a square hole into a blah, blah. With Snackable Bakes, because it so much is me and really how I want everyone to bake because it's how I like to bake, it wasn't that hard to do. I mean, sometimes I've thought, gosh, would this taste better if it had like 4 different spices in it? And am I holding back and just calling for cinnamon because I don't want a long ingredients list? Yes, that's true. And I think if I was going to do it again, I'd probably put in the spices. Because what I also found from readers, I was lucky enough to have my book was, there's a Food 52 baking club on Facebook. And they picked my book for their September book. And it was an absolutely fascinating experience as a cookbook writer. Because first of all, I'm just like the person who answers every single comment, answers every single DM. Anybody contacts me in any way, even like crazy, I'm the weirdo who's responding to everyone. I joined the Facebook baking club and I responded to every comment. People would say like that my apple pie bars, people loved the apple pie bars, but some people said, I think it needs more flavor. I put some nutmeg into the crumb. I put some cinnamon. And I realized, oh, you know, these are still easy peasy bakes, but people are adding a bit more. I was afraid to do that because I didn't want people to be like, what? You said it was easy peasy and I see 10 ingredients. So it's a learning curve-ish. But I tried to keep to the rules that I set in that original proposal.
Well, and I also think that those 20-minute or less helped you and your recipe tester during that process, because if it had to be done again, at least you were in for something that could be done within a short time. And I was listening to something recently, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell was talking about how having a lot of rigidity or parameters actually frees up creativity in this interesting way because you're not considering everything. You have these limits, and so you have this deeper focus. It's a very interesting approach, I think, to cookbook creation. It's really exciting to see what comes out of that.
I couldn't agree more. And I think for some of us, it's not for everyone, but for those of us that like rules and structure, and I love being told what to do. Whenever I'm freelancing, I'm always like, well, do you need any SEO baking recipes? Like I am 100% fine with somebody I work for just saying, make us I just made a German chocolate pie for Food 52. I didn't come up with that idea. They did. I was like, great, please tell me what to do. So for some of us, that's really appealing. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right, Molly. For me, the structure of that, first of all, you're exactly right. Stephanie and I were able to do this because each recipe only takes 20 minutes. So you know, you fuck it up, you redo it.
Right. And your ingredient list is short too, so you're not running to the store to buy some exotic
100%.
agreement. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Really interesting.
100%.
Well, before we let you go, Jessie, I know we want to hear about an exciting new podcast you're working on, but also what's next?
I have signed a contract. I won't get into the details of what the book's going to be about yet, but I will say it's more easy peasy recipes. But maybe they are savory.
No.
But maybe not. Who knows?
Maybe not.
Oh, the voracious
We'll have
sweet
to follow
tooth
you
might.
on all your platforms to find out more, apparently.
It's a little scary, I won't lie, because I'm like, just a minute, can I even write something like this? But I think we'll see.
Well, that's exciting to me. I'm more salty than sweet, so I will.
Okay, good.
I'll keep that in mind. And then what about the podcast?
Oh, so this is really cool. I'm working with Cherry Bomb. We created a podcast called She's My Cherry Pie. It is a baking podcast in which I interview some of the sweetest names in baking, some of the sweetest peeps in the baking world, and I do a deep dive on their signature bake. For instance, I just interviewed Lisa Ludwinski from Sister Pie Bakery in Detroit, and we did a deep dive on her pie dough right in time for Thanksgiving. That was our first episode that dropped. And then I just did an episode with Cheryl Day, the biscuit queen, when she and I did a deep dive on her biscuits. And then there'll be 4 more episodes in 2022 of sort of the She's My Cherry Pie mini-series. And then in 2023, it will be its own podcast.
Woohoo.
That's
so
great.
People can subscribe, listen, review, rate, all that fun stuff wherever they get their podcasts. Well, Jessie, this has been such a delight to talk with you about Snackable Bakes.
We'll put all the links to your books and all the ways for the listeners to find you and your new podcast in our show notes.
Thank you. And again, I mean, I know I'm a broken record, but I love your podcast so much. I think I'm sure it's interesting to everyone, but for cookbook writers, oh my gosh, it is absolutely fascinating. I learn something every time I listen, and I just adore it. I can't wait for the next one each week.
Well, and we've learned a bunch of things from you, especially if we're ever in a situation where we have to do 100 recipes in under a year, I know who to call.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jessie.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Everything Cookbooks. Send us questions or comments through our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes on Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our page at bookshop.org. Thanks to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. Till next time, keep on reading, writing, and cooking.